The shirt was in her hands before Oscar Talbot even registered. She had crossed the room to pick it up. He stood in the doorway of her small adobe house on the edge of Sulfur Creek, New Mexico territory, the year 1882 burning dry and merciless around every edge of the desert horizon, and he watched Olive Ford thread a needle with the particular calm of a woman who has already made up her mind about something. She did not look at him. She did not ask permission. She sat down in the cane-back chair beside the window, where the afternoon light fell gold and unforgiving, and she began to stitch the torn seam along his left shoulder, with small, precise movements that made his chest tighten in a way he could not name and absolutely could not afford. He had ridden into Sulfur Creek 4 days ago with 3 things: a badge he no longer wore openly, a name that 2 men in this territory wanted erased from the earth, and a wound along his ribs that had soaked through 2 layers of linen and left rust-colored evidence on the cotton shirt he now watched Olive mend without a single word of explanation or invitation. She had not asked him about the wound. She had not asked about the blood. She had simply appeared at his rented room above Hector Dunn's general store on the second morning, knocked once, and handed him a plate of cornbread and a jar of clean water. He had told himself it was the charity of a good woman toward a stranger, the kind of civic kindness that small frontier towns occasionally still produce despite everything the West had done to hollow generosity out of people. He had told himself that again on the 3rd morning, when she brought a tin of salve and set it on the windowsill without coming inside. He was having considerably more trouble telling himself anything now, watching her hands move with that quiet certainty over his ruined shirt, her dark hair pinned up at the back of her neck with 2 tortoiseshell combs, her eyes lowered and focused, her lips pressed gently together in concentration. Oscar Talbot had survived 6 years as a deputy marshal working territories, where survival required a man to see traps before they were sprung. He had walked out of ambushes in Tombstone and Lincoln County both. He had recognized betrayal on the face of men he had trusted like brothers. He had developed, through sheer necessity, an instinct for danger that operated several seconds ahead of his conscious mind. That instinct was screaming at him now, not because Olive Ford was dangerous in any way the word was usually meant, but because a woman who mends your torn shirt without comment, without leverage, without expectation visible on her face, is a woman who has already decided something about you. And Oscar Talbot had spent the last 2 years constructing a life specifically designed to prevent any person from deciding anything about him at all. He was already in trouble. He simply did not know yet how deep it would go before either of them surfaced. The story of how he arrived in Sulfur Creek, New Mexico territory, in the late summer of 1882 began 3 weeks earlier in Santa Fe, where Oscar Talbot received a letter that should not have existed. He had been sitting in the shade outside a cantina on Palace Avenue, nursing a glass of water because he had given up whiskey 14 months ago after an incident in Albuquerque that he permitted himself to think about only in the middle of the night when there was no alternative. The letter was delivered by a boy of perhaps 12 who slapped it against Oscar's knee and disappeared before Oscar could ask who had sent it. The envelope was plain. His name on the front was written in a hand he recognized immediately, which was the first problem, because the man whose handwriting it was had been reported dead in Tucson 6 months prior. His name was Calhoun Webb. He had been, at various points in his life, a land agent, a confidence man, a witness for a federal prosecution Oscar had conducted in the Arizona Territory in 1879, and apparently a man considerably more alive than his death certificate suggested. The letter contained 2 lines. The first said, "They know you helped me. They have a man in Sulfur Creek watching for you." The second said, "The woman knows where the documents are. Do not trust her." Oscar had read those 2 lines approximately 40 times between Santa Fe and Sulfur Creek, and he still could not determine which of the 3 possible meanings was the correct one. The most charitable interpretation was that Calhoun Webb having faked his own death for reasons Oscar could only speculate about, was trying to warn him that the Alderman Syndicate, the organized land theft operation he had helped prosecute 3 years ago, had tracked him down and placed an operative in the small town of Sulfur Creek, New Mexico territory, specifically to intercept him. The second interpretation was that the letter was itself a trap, sent by someone who had gotten hold of Calhoun's handwriting, designed to lure Oscar into a specific location where the alderman men could deal with him quietly, away from any federal oversight. The third interpretation, the one that disturbed him most in the deep hours of the night, was that both things in the letter were simultaneously true, and that the woman in question was real, and that she was sitting in Sulfur Creek holding onto evidence that could either destroy the Alderman Syndicate permanently or get her killed. He had ridden into Sulfur Creek intending to spend 3 days, identify the watcher, locate any documentation worth protecting, and disappear before anyone connected him to the investigation he no longer officially worked for. He had not planned on the wound. He had acquired it on the second night in a dark alley behind the livery stable, when a man with a Bowie knife came at him from a doorway that should have been empty. And Oscar, who was fast but not as fast as he had been at 28, had taken the blade across his left ribs before he managed to put enough distance between himself and the man to make further attack impractical. The man had run. Oscar had not pursued him, which told him something important about how badly the wound was actually bleeding. He had made it back to his room above Hector Dunn's store and done his best with what he had, which was limited. He had not planned on Olive Ford either. He had not planned on her at all. He learned her name on the first morning from Hector Dunn himself, who mentioned her with the particular combination of admiration and protective wariness that small-town men develop toward women they consider too fine for local circumstances. She ran the town's only school out of a building she had partially constructed with her own money after arriving in Sulfur Creek 18 months ago from somewhere in the eastern part of Texas. She was 26 years old, Hector said, and she minded her own business more consistently than anyone he had ever met, which he considered both a virtue and a mild reproach to the rest of the town's tendency toward gossip. Oscar had listened to this with the professional attention of a man cataloging local intelligence, and felt nothing in particular about it. Then he had looked out the window and seen her crossing the main road below, carrying a stack of books that came up to her chin, wearing a blue dress the color of creek water in winter, and the professional attention had developed an uninvited personal component that Oscar Talbot, former deputy marshal, man with a dark past and current target of at least 2 separate and genuinely dangerous parties, absolutely did not have time for. He had told himself this clearly and at length, standing at that window. It had not helped. Sulfur Creek was a town of perhaps 240 people, situated in the high desert of New Mexico territory between the Rio Grande and the San Andres Mountains. It had a general store, a small hotel called the Creekside, a saloon called the Dusty Pedal whose name Oscar found inexplicably cheerful given the clientele, a blacksmith, a church that was also sometimes used as a courthouse, an Olive Ford school, which occupied a low building on the east side of the main road with a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, in careful block letters, Sulfur Creek Common School, 1881. It also had, Oscar determined by the end of his first day, a man named Dex Prater who sat at a corner table in the Dusty Pedal from mid-morning onward and watched the door with the specific, patient attention of a man being paid to watch something. Dex Prater was perhaps 35, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that was not actually calm, but was rather the compression of perpetual readiness. He had the boots of a man who spent more time on horseback than on foot, and the hands of a man who knew how to use the revolver that sat on his hip with practiced ease. He watched Oscar come through the door of the saloon on the first afternoon with the quality of attention that confirmed everything. Oscar bought a glass of water, sat with it at the bar, and spent 40 minutes analyzing exit routes, sightlines, and the structural question of whether Dex Prater was the only watcher or whether he had a partner positioned somewhere else in town. He concluded there was probably a second man, possibly at the hotel, possibly not yet arrived. He also concluded that whoever had sent Dex Prater to Sulfur Creek was not playing a patient game. The knife in the alley on the second night confirmed that. They were not waiting for Oscar to find something and then intercept him. They were trying to remove him preemptively, which meant either they were confident enough in their position that they did not fear the noise of a disappearance, or they were afraid of something specific that Oscar might find, and the fear was making them move too fast. The documents from Calhoun Webb's letter. Oscar lay in his rented room above the general store on the third night, ribs aching with every breath, and thought about what documents could frighten the Alderman Syndicate badly enough that they would risk this kind of open aggression in a populated territory. The answer he kept arriving at was land deeds. Specifically, fraudulent land deeds that the Alderman organization had been filing with territorial land offices since at least 1877, displacing homesteaders, ranchers, and in several documented cases, families who had held their land since before the territory existed in its current form. He had built a prosecution around a subset of those deeds in 1879. That prosecution had resulted in 3 convictions and the supposed death of Calhoun Webb, who had been the syndicate's primary document forger before he agreed to testify. If Calhoun had kept copies, physical evidence, original forgeries with identifiable characteristics, and if those copies were somewhere in Sulfur Creek, then the Alderman Syndicate had every reason to want that evidence destroyed and every reason to want Oscar Talbot, who would know exactly what to do with it, nowhere near it. The woman knows where the documents are. He had been lying there thinking about that sentence when he heard the single knock on his door and opened it to find Olive Ford with a tin of salve on her palm and the expression of someone who had made a practical decision and was not inviting discussion of it. He had not asked how she knew. She had placed the tin on the windowsill and left. He had stood holding the door open longer than was reasonable, looking at where she had been. And now it was the following afternoon, and she was in his room mending his shirt, and Oscar Talbot, who had navigated genuine federal conspiracies and genuine mortal danger for 6 years without losing his composure once, felt the specific internal vertigo of a man realizing that the most dangerous thing in his current situation was not the knife or Dex Prater or the Alderman Syndicate. It was the quality of silence that Olive Ford could produce around a simple act of care. She finished the seam along the shoulder and began on a second tier near the hem, her needle moving in small arcs. The afternoon light moved with the slow deliberation of desert afternoons, casting longer and longer shadows across the wooden floor. Oscar cleared his throat. "Miss Ford," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said without looking up. He tried again. "You don't need to do that." "I know," she said. The needle kept moving. He tried to think of something to say that would move the conversation onto professional ground, would establish some kind of boundary that his common sense was insisting was necessary, and found that every sentence he assembled in his head sounded either rude or dishonest. "The salve helped," he said finally. She did look up then. Her eyes were a deep brown, the color of river walnut, and they had a directness in them that Oscar found simultaneously steadying and unsettling, the way a fixed point on the horizon is both a comfort and a reminder of how far you are from it. "It usually does," she said, and went back to the shirt. He sat down on the edge of the bed because standing in the doorway had begun to feel theatrical. He watched her work and decided that if he was going to be in trouble, he might as well be in it honestly. "Someone broke into your school 3 nights ago," he said. Her hands did not stop moving. "I know, I found the mess. What were they looking for?" This time she set the needle down on her knee and looked at him fully, and for the first time since she had entered the room, She let her expression say something more complicated than professional composure. There was something in it that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the way a thunderhead on the horizon is not yet the storm but carries all the information about what is coming. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Oscar Talbot. I rented the room above the general store 4 days ago." "That is not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the desert wind moved through the street and lifted a little dust and dropped it again. "I used to work for the federal marshal's service," he said. "Out of Santa Fe. I am not currently employed by them or by anyone else. I am here because I received a letter that told me I needed to be here, and I am trying to determine whether that letter was genuine or a trap designed to bring me into range of men who want me dead." Olive Ford picked up the needle again. "Calhoun Webb," she said quietly. The name hit Oscar like cold water. He went very still. "You knew him," he said. "He was my father's oldest friend," she said. "He came through Sulfur Creek 8 months ago. He told me he had faked his death. He told me he was afraid. He left a box of papers in my care and told me to burn them if anyone came looking except a man named Talbot." She paused. "He described you precisely enough that I recognized you the morning you arrived." Oscar sat with this for a long moment, arranging what it meant. "That is why you came," he said. "The cornbread, the salve. I was trying to determine whether you were actually you," she said simply, "or whether someone was using Calhoun's name to fish for me. And now, the knife wound is consistent with a man who walked into someone else's trap rather than setting one," she said. "And you drink water instead of whiskey, which Calhoun told me to look for." Oscar let out a breath that was longer than he intended. "Calhoun told you a great deal. He trusted me," she said. "He had reason to." "Where is the box?" "Safe." She tied off the thread and bit it with her teeth, a quick, clean motion that was somehow entirely natural, and held up the shirt to check the seam in the light. "I will show you when I am satisfied that showing you will not get both of us killed immediately." "That is reasonable," Oscar said. She handed him the shirt. Their fingers did not touch. The air between their hands felt like something anyway. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said, and stood, and walked to the door with the cane-back chair tucked under her arm, because she had brought it with her from across the street and apparently saw no reason to leave it behind. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. "The man in the saloon, the one who watches the door, he has a partner. His partner arrived yesterday on the westbound stage and is staying at the hotel under the name Crawford." Oscar stared at her. "I told you," she said, with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but contained the essential architecture of one. "I was determining whether you were trustworthy. I was not sitting still." She left. Oscar sat holding the mended shirt and understood for the first time in his adult life what it meant to be genuinely outmaneuvered by someone who was not his enemy. He spent the next hour thinking clearly about the situation, and approximately 2 minutes out of every 10 thinking about the lift at the corner of Olive Ford's mouth, which was not a productive use of his limited resources, but which he appeared to be incapable of preventing. The practical reality was this. There were 2 alderman men in Sulfur Creek, one visible and one recently arrived and still establishing himself. There was a box of documents in Olive Ford's possession that represented, if Calhoun Webb's testimony during the 1879 prosecution was any guide, the most comprehensive physical evidence of the syndicate's fraudulent land scheme in existence. And those documents, if they could be gotten to a federal marshal, would not only confirm and extend the earlier convictions, but would likely implicate several individuals who had been too careful or too well connected to be caught in the first prosecution. Oscar no longer carried a badge, but he still had contacts. He had a man in Albuquerque named Rowan Fitch, who worked for the marshal's office, and who owed Oscar a debt of professional gratitude that Oscar had never called in because he had never needed to before. If he could get a letter to Fitch, Fitch could be in Sulfur Creek in 4 days with the kind of official authority that would make Dex Prater and his hotel-dwelling colleague considerably less of a threat. 4 days, however, was a long time to keep Olive Ford safe in a town where two men were already willing to use knives in dark alleys. He pulled on the mended shirt carefully, working around the ribs, and felt the new seam hold cleanly. He pressed his thumb against it. Clean, strong, invisible from the outside. He had to stop thinking about what it meant that she had done that. He went downstairs and crossed the street to the post office, which was a corner of Hector Dunn's store distinguished from the rest of it by a partition and a grid of wooden cubbies. He composed a letter to Rowan Fitch in the careful, coded language he and Fitch had developed years ago for situations where interception was possible, paid Hector, done 3 cents for the stamp, and watched the letter disappear into the outgoing bag with the mingled relief and anxiety of a man who has just made an irreversible commitment. Then he walked to the school. The school was in session. He could hear through the partially open window the sound of a lesson in progress, Olive Ford's voice clear and unhurried, asking a child to read from something, the child's reading halting and gradually gaining confidence. He sat on the bench outside the door that was there for parents and waited. The lesson ended in the traditional explosion of noise as children were released into the late afternoon. They came through the door in a river, some of them glancing at him with the frank curiosity of children who have not yet learned to disguise it, a few of the older ones with more calculation. He counted 11 children between what appeared to be the ages of 6 and 14. Several were the children of local ranchers. At least 3, he guessed from their faces and the particular quality of their clothes, were from families who did not have a great deal, and Olive Ford was teaching them for free or near it, which was not unusual for the territory but was worth noting. Olive came out last, carrying a primer under one arm and a slate board under the other, and stopped when she saw him on the bench. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Not alarmed, simply practical. "Not immediately," he said. "I sent a letter to a contact in Albuquerque. I need to ask you a question before I can tell you what to expect next." She looked at the remaining children who were dispersing across the road. She called something to 2 of them about tomorrow's reading assignment. Then she sat on the other end of the bench, set the primer and slate down between them, and folded her hands on her knee. "Ask," she said. "The box," Oscar said. "How heavy is it?" She considered this. "I could carry it. A man your size could carry it one-handed. Could you move it in the next 12 hours, somewhere that is not your house or the school?" She was quiet for a moment. "You think they will move soon?" "The second man arrived yesterday. They have been in town 5 days. If they were going to simply watch, they would have been patient from the beginning. The knife was not patient. I think the arrival of the second man means they are done waiting for me to lead them to something and have decided to search directly." He paused. "Your school was broken into 3 nights ago. Your house has not been searched yet, but if they did not find what they wanted in the school tonight," she said. "Possibly." She stood, picked up the primer and the slate. "Come after dark. I will have it ready." "Olive," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both recognized it at the same moment. That small shift in register that means something has changed, that a certain formality has been set aside and cannot quite be retrieved. Her expression did something careful and complicated. "I know," she said simply, and walked inside. He was not certain what she knew. He was not entirely certain what he knew either. He went back across the street and spent the remainder of the afternoon thinking about Dex Prater and the man named Crawford and the geography of Sulfur Creek, and trying very hard to think about nothing else. He was mostly unsuccessful. When the sun went down and the desert sky turned the particular shade of violet that comes just before full dark, Oscar ate at the small Mexican restaurant 2 doors down from the general store and observed the comings and goings of the dusty peddle from the window. Dex Prater went in at 6 and was still there at 8. That did not tell him much about Crawford. He crossed the street at 9, moving quietly along the side of the building rather than the main road. Olive Ford's house sat behind the school, connected by a short path. The house was dark on the street side, which was smart. He went around to the back door and knocked once, two pauses, once again, the pattern they had not agreed on, but that seemed natural when he did it, the kind of pattern that says, "It is me, not them." The door opened. Olive was holding a small oil lamp turned low, and behind her on the kitchen table sat a wooden box approximately the size of a bread crate, banded with iron at the corners. It was worn smooth from handling. It had a padlock on it that was not currently latched. "I need to tell you something before you take it," Olive said. Oscar came inside and she shut the door behind him. The kitchen was small and clean, with bunches of dried herbs hanging from a beam and a cast-iron stove that still held some warmth from the evening meal. There was a chair he recognized, the cane-back chair from that afternoon. He was beginning to feel that the cane-back chair was a signal of some kind. "Tell me," he said. She set the lamp on the table and put both hands on the edge of the box. "When Calhoun brought this to me, he told me it contained evidence of the land fraud. 43 fraudulent deeds, with the original forgeries and the documentation of how they were processed through the land office. He said there was a deputy in the land registration office in Santa Fe who was part of it, a man named Grier." She paused. "He also told me something else. He said that one of the deeds in this box belongs to my family, my father's ranch in Fisher County, Texas. He said the Alderman Syndicate has already filed a claim on it using a forged deed, and that if this evidence is destroyed or disappears, my family has no legal recourse. They will lose the land they have worked for 30 years. The room was very quiet. Oscar looked at her face in the lamplight and saw what the composure had been holding back all along. Not fear exactly, but the compressed weight of someone carrying a secret that is both personal and enormous, who has been carrying it alone for 8 months without anyone to set any part of it down with. "Why didn't you say that immediately?" he asked, and his voice came out gentler than he intended. "Because I needed to know whether you were the kind of man who would use it," she said. "Use it how?" "To make me cooperative," she said. "If you had known from the beginning that I had a personal stake in this evidence, you could have leveraged it. Some men would have." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would not." "I know that now," she said. "That is why I am telling you." Oscar sat down at the kitchen table because standing felt wrong somehow, like it was using height as a kind of authority he had not earned. He looked at the box. He looked at his hands. He thought about a family in Fisher County, Texas, working 30 years of land that someone in an office in Santa Fe had decided to steal with a pen and a forged signature, and felt the particular anger that had made him a good marshal, and occasionally a difficult one rise up steady and clear. "We are going to stop them," he said. "Yes," said Olive. "I know." And for the first time there was no qualification in her voice, no careful wait-and-see. She said it the way you say something you have been certain of alone for a long time and have finally found someone to be certain of it with. They spent the next 2 hours going through the box together at the kitchen table, Oscar in the chair and Olive pulling a second one up beside him, the lamp between them, the papers laid out in careful order. The documents were exactly what Calhoun Webb had described. 43 fraudulent deeds, each one a masterpiece of patient, technically sophisticated forgery. Oscar had seen Calhoun's work before in the original prosecution, but seeing the original documents themselves, the genuine deed alongside the forgery, the paper marks, the ink variations, the tiny deliberate imperfections designed to make the forgery look aged and authentic, made the scale of it real in a way that files and testimony had not. Olive pointed to one deed near the bottom of the stack. "There," she said. Oscar picked it up. It was for a property identified as the Ford River Ranch, Fisher County, Texas. The fraudulent deed was dated 1880, 18 months after the genuine deed. Calhoun had also included a faded, weathered document with the seal of the Republic of Texas visible beneath the later territorial certification. The forgery was convincing. Without the original beside it, and without Calhoun's documentation of how the forgery had been produced, a land office clerk would have had no reason to question it. Oscar set the two documents side by side and looked at them for a long time. "Your father," he said. "Elijah Ford," she said. "He built the ranch with my mother. She died when I was 16. He has been running it alone since then with 2 hired hands. He is 61 years old." She paused. "He does not know about the deed yet. Calhoun told me not to tell him until the matter was resolved, because knowing and being unable to do anything which she stopped would be its own kind of damage," Oscar finished. "Yes," she said softly. "He put the documents back in the order they had found them. We need to keep this box somewhere they cannot reach it in the next 4 days. Where did you store it before?" "Under the floor," she said, "beneath the loose board by the stove." "But if they search tonight, not the floor," Oscar agreed. "What about the church?" Olive considered this. "Reverend Cleary is a trustworthy man. If I asked him to hold something, he would hold it and ask no questions. Can you go now, tonight, at 9 in the evening? If Reverend Cleary is trustworthy, he will understand." She looked at him. The lamplight was between them, and it made the shadows fall in a way that made her expression harder to read than usual, which he found himself resisting. He was paying more attention to her face than was strictly required for operational planning, and he knew it. "I will go," she said. "You should not come. It will attract less notice if I go alone. I do not like you going alone while Prater and Crawford are still active. I grew up in Fisher County, Texas," she said. "I have been managing men with bad intentions since I was old enough to carry a rifle, which I have, incidentally." She said this with a calm matter-of-factness that was so completely devoid of drama that it landed harder than any bravado would have. "I know you can handle yourself," he said. "I am not concerned about your competence. I am concerned about the odds." Something in his voice must have carried more than he intended, because she went still and looked at him with that direct, river walnut gaze, and the kitchen felt very quiet and very small. "All right," she said finally. "Then come as far as the corner of the road. Stay in the shadow. If I am not back in 20 minutes, make decisions accordingly." "Agreed," he said. They went out the back, and she carried the box with both arms while he watched the street. He stood at the corner where she said, in the deep shadow of the building's overhang, and watched her cross the road and disappear toward the small white church at the far end of town. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip. The street was quiet. A lamp burned in the dusty pedal. Above the saloon, the desert stars were enormous and brilliant, the way they get at altitude, crowded and precise. He counted the minutes. 14 minutes after she left, Olive returned across the empty road carrying nothing, and she was walking faster than she had gone. When she reached him, she said quietly, "Done. Reverend Cleary will keep it in the sacristy. He did not ask questions, but he said a prayer which I think covers us sufficiently." Oscar breathed. "Good. Now what?" she asked. They were standing close in the shadow, not quite touching, the overhang low enough above them that the night felt compressed, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with circumstance, and the particular way proximity works in the dark. "Now we wait for Fitch," he said. 4 days. 4 days, she repeated. "And we try to keep Prater and Crawford from deciding to move directly against you before he arrives." She tilted her head slightly. "How do we do that?" "We make them uncertain," he said. "About what we know, about what we have. Right now they are watching and probing because they believe we have something they want. If we behave in ways that make them doubt whether what they want is here at all, we might buy the time we need." He paused. "It is a calculated risk." "All the alternatives seem worse," she said. "Yes," he said, "they do." She looked at him. The stars were above them, and the desert was very quiet, and there was something in the way she was looking at him that was not about the documents or the syndicate or the next 4 days. It was simpler than that and more complicated. "Thank you," she said, "for taking this seriously." "How could I not?" he said. "A great many people have not," she said quietly. "When I came to Sulfur Creek, I went first to the county sheriff, a man named Briggs. I told him about the documents. He told me that a schoolteacher's word about a federal land fraud was not something he had authority over, and that I ought to write a letter to Santa Fe. He was not unkind. He simply did not believe that a woman alone in possession of a box of papers represented a situation that required his attention. Oscar was quiet for a moment. The familiar weight of that particular injustice settled in the conversation. He had seen it before, in courtrooms and in small offices, and in the expressions of marshals who were good men and still managed not to see what was directly in front of them. "He was wrong," Oscar said. "Yes," Olive said. "He was." They stood in the shadow a moment longer. Then she took a step back and the compressed intimacy of the overhang loosened its hold, and the night reasserted its ordinary dimensions. "Good night, Oscar," she said. "Good night, Olive," he said, and watched her go inside. He went back across the street and sat by the window of his room above the general store and looked at the dark street for a long time before he admitted to himself that the trouble he was in was not going to be resolved by Rowan Fitch's arrival. Rowan Fitch could resolve the syndicate problem, and the document problem, and the problem of Dex Prater, and the man named Crawford. He could not resolve the problem of Oscar Talbot sitting in a rented room above a general store in Sulfur Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1882, thinking about a woman who mended his shirt without comment, and carried a box of federal evidence to a church at 9 o'clock at night without a tremor in her hands, and still had enough clarity to notice that it mattered, to say thank you in a way that meant something specific and true. He was 32 years old. He had been, for most of that time, a man in motion, which was partly circumstance and partly, he was honest enough to acknowledge in the middle of the night, preference. A man in motion does not have to examine what he is moving away from. He had constructed a biography out of forward momentum and told himself it was dedication to the work. The work was real. The dedication was real. But so was the pattern. He sat with that for a long time. Then he went to bed and slept, which he had not been doing well since the knife, with the quality of sleep that comes when something unresolved has at least been acknowledged. The next morning he went to the Dusty Pedal at the same time he had gone every morning, ordered water, sat at the bar. Dex Prater was at his corner table. Oscar did not look at him directly. He chatted briefly with the barkeeper about the price of cattle and the possibility of rain and the quality of the road north to Las Vegas, all of which were topics of genuine and innocent interest to any man passing through, and then he left. He spent the morning visible in the town in ways that required no explanation, looking at horses at the livery, buying a tin of tobacco at the general store even though he did not use it, sitting on the bench outside the post office with the look of a man idly waiting for correspondence. He was making himself readable, easy to watch, easy to categorize, predictable in his movements. A man who was confident he had nothing to hide tends to be unhurried. At midday he saw the man he believed was Crawford for the first time, stepping out of the hotel onto the main street. Crawford was younger than Prater, perhaps 27 or 28, with a lean economy of movement that suggested he was capable but not yet experienced, which could be either an advantage or a liability depending on circumstances. He glanced down the street, and his gaze moved past Oscar with the practiced smoothness of someone trained to look without looking. Oscar noted the cut of his coat, the boots, the position of the holster. He filed it all and walked to the Mexican restaurant for lunch. Olive was already there at a corner table with two students, an older girl and a boy of about 10, whom she was apparently tutoring through the noon hour. She looked up when Oscar came in and gave a nod that was calibrated for two people who know each other from the context of a small town, professionally cordial, not concealing anything, not displaying anything. Exactly right. He sat at the bar and ordered beans and tortillas, and thought that the woman across the room was significantly more skilled at this than she had any obvious reason to be. When the students left, she remained for a few minutes, making notes in a small book. Oscar paid and stood to leave, and she said, without looking up from the book, "The man from the hotel was looking at the school this morning." He paused. "How long?" 20 minutes from across the road." She turned a page. "He did not try the door." "Not yet," Oscar said. Reverend Cleary has agreed to sleep at the church, she said. He still has not asked why. Good man, Oscar said. She looked up then, and there was something warming in her eyes that was different from the controlled composure she had shown him before, something that seemed to be addressed specifically to the way he had said good man about a person she clearly trusted and respected. He is, she agreed. Oscar left and went about the second day of being uninteresting, which is the most demanding kind of performance. The days built up in layers. The letter to Rowan Fitch was 3 days old, and in 4 days the reply would come, or more likely Fitch himself, because the situation as Oscar had described it in coded language was the kind of thing that brings a man rather than a letter. In the meantime, the careful geography of Sulfur Creek, the distances between building and building, the quality of the night. The things that happened between Oscar Talbot and Olive Ford in the spaces that were not the operational problem. She brought him dinner on the second evening, not at his room this time but from the Mexican restaurant, 2 covered plates that she set on the counter of the store, while Hector Dunn watched with an expression of elaborate disinterest that fooled no one. She sat across from him at the counter and they ate and talked about Sulphur Creek, and about the school, and about Fisher County, Texas, and the nature of land and what it means to people who have built something with their hands on a specific piece of the earth. She talked about her father with the combination of love and distance that develops between people who are close and separated by geography, who love each other fully but have chosen different paths. He wanted me to stay, she said, after my mother died. He needed the help and I was the eldest, but there was nothing in Fisher County for me beyond what I already knew. I wanted to teach. I wanted, she stopped. To be somewhere that was yours, Oscar said. She looked at him. Yes, exactly that. The school, he said. It was falling down when I arrived, she said. Literally. The roof was open in 3 places. The school board had $22 and no plan. I spent most of my savings on lumber and hired 2 men from the ranch outside town to help with the repairs. A pause that was almost a laugh. The children helped too. Even the small ones carried boards. He could see it. He could see it very clearly, and the clarity of it went somewhere in him that he had not been anticipating. When did you arrive? He asked. March of '81, she said. 18 months ago. It was cold still, and the road from Las Vegas was terrible. My wagon lost a wheel outside town, and I had to walk the last 2 miles carrying my trunk by the handle. It weighed 40 pounds. She smiled, fully this time, and it was like something coming open. I arrived in Sulphur Creek covered in dust and bad-tempered as anything, and Hector Dunn came out of the store and looked at me like I was a catastrophe that had decided to visit his town, and I told him I was the new schoolteacher, and he said, God help us, and gave me a cup of coffee. Oscar laughed. It was a real laugh, unplanned, and it surprised both of them. He had not laughed in a while. He had not realized until that moment how long it had been. Olive was watching him with that careful directness, and her smile softened into something more attentive. You have a good laugh, she said. I had wondered. Whether you ever did, she said simply, and picked up her fork. They finished dinner, and she went home, and Oscar sat at the counter for a long time after, aware that the operational reality of his situation had not changed by a single fact, and that the emotional reality of his situation had changed considerably, and that these 2 realities were about to have to coexist in a way that he found both necessary and difficult. The 3rd day. Oscar was at the post office, genuinely this time, checking for any message, when Hector Dunn found him with a look on his face that was the look of a man who has seen something concerning and has not yet decided how concerned to be. The men in the saloon, Hector said quietly, Prater and the other one. I heard them talking this morning when I was making a delivery to the kitchen. I did not hear much. I heard the schoolteacher and tonight and Dunn waiting. Oscar kept his face still. Thank you, Hector. Is Olive in danger? Hector asked, and his voice had the particular fierceness of a man who feels protective of someone and is afraid of the answer. I am going to make sure she is not, Oscar said. Is there something I can do? Do you own a rifle? A Winchester? Keep it close tonight, Oscar said, And if you hear shots, go to the church, not toward them." He crossed the street at a pace that was not running, because running draws attention, but that covered distance as quickly as walking could. He went to the school. Olive was in the middle of a lesson, and he stood at the door and caught her eye, and when she saw his face she understood immediately. She told the children to read the next 2 pages to themselves and came to the door. "Tonight," he said quietly. She did not pale or flinch. "The Reverend is at the church, but you cannot be at your house." She thought for exactly 2 seconds. "I will send the children home early. I will tell them the stove has a problem, which is even true because the flu has been sticking since June. Then I will." She paused. "Where should I be?" "With me," he said. "In the room above the store. It is the most defensible position in town, and Hector already has his rifle." She looked at him. The practical reality of what that meant in terms of propriety and small-town observation was visible in her face for a moment, not as a frivolous social concern, but as a real consideration about the kind of life she had built here, and what it meant if this night became a story people told. She weighed it against the alternative. "All right," she said. "Olive, I am not concerned about my reputation," she said quietly. "I am concerned about being alive to have one. All right." She dismissed the children at 2 in the afternoon with an explanation about the stove. Oscar went back across the street and checked the room. 2 windows, both visible from the main road, positions where a man could enter and positions where a man inside could not easily be taken by surprise. He moved the small furniture. He checked his revolver and the spare he kept in his pack. He sat in the chair by the window. Olive arrived at 4 with a covered pan and told him she had made enough stew to be sensible about it. She set the pan on the cold stove and they ate standing at the window because the chairs were positioned for sightlines. The stew was good, with dried chili and something fragrant that he could not identify. "Episode," she said when he asked. "The woman who runs the restaurant taught me. She has been very patient with my questions about her kitchen." "You cook like this regularly?" "I like cooking," she said, with a slight surprise in her voice, as though it had not occurred to her that this was notable. "There is something satisfying about it. The way a specific combination of things becomes something else entirely." He thought about that, about transformation and the quiet alchemy of ordinary ingredients. About a woman in a small house on the edge of the desert building a life out of the components available to her. A falling down school, a box of evidence, a community that needed a teacher, a father's land threatened from a distance, and something in herself that refused to be reduced by any of it. "Olive," he said. She looked at him. The light was going outside, the desert violet coming on, and in the dimming light of the room she was very still and very present, and he was aware of her in a way that had been building since the shirt and the needle and the silence, and that he could not continue to pretend was peripheral. "I need to say something that has nothing to do with the current situation," he said. "Or rather, it has everything to do with it, but not in the operational sense." She waited. "I have been," he started and then reorganized. "I am not a man who another stop." He looked at her and decided that the language he was reaching for was the language of someone who had too much practice at distance, who was forming careful sentences specifically designed to protect himself. And that Olive Ford, who had sat in his rented room and mended his shirt without comment, and trusted him with her father's land and her 8 months of solitary fear, deserved something more honest than that. "I think about you continuously," he said. "In the middle of conversations that have nothing to do with you, and in the middle of the night, and right now, standing 6 feet away from you with a pan of stew between us and 2 men in this town who intend to come through that door at some point, I am thinking about you. I am telling you this because I am not able to not tell you, and because I believe you should know it regardless of what it leads to or does not lead to." The room was quiet. Outside, the first star appeared above the western hills, one bright point in the fading blue. Olive set down her spoon very slowly on the edge of the pan. She looked at him with the river walnut eyes and the quality of attention that he had come to recognize as her particular version of a full yes, of her whole self deciding to be present. I know, she said. I have known for several days. And, he said, and I think it is entirely mutual, she said, which I suspect you also know given that you are not a man who misses things. He took a breath. The timing is terrible, she agreed. Completely terrible. 2 men are coming tonight who intend to harm both of us and possibly to search my house and destroy evidence that represents my family's future and the legal security of 43 other families besides. The timing is genuinely bad. Yes, he said, and I want you to know anyway, she said, because you told me and it was honest, and the least I can do is be equally honest. I have thought about you continuously since you arrived in Sulfur Creek, and it has been, frankly, an inconvenient addition to an already complicated month. The corners of his mouth moved. I am sorry for adding to the inconvenience. No, you are not, she said, and now there was the full smile, open and clear, and it did what it always did to his chest. No, he admitted, I am not. They stayed at the window as the dark came on, and the conversation moved between the practical and the personal in the way that conversations do when 2 people are being honest with each other in a small space during a night that contains genuine danger. He told her about the work and what it had cost, the years on the road, the witnesses who had lived and the ones who had not, the incident in Albuquerque that had made him give up whiskey, which turned out to be simpler and sadder than she had perhaps expected. A man he had been protecting, killed in a hotel room while Oscar was in the saloon below, and the particular unresolvable mathematics of that equation. She told him about coming to terms with her mother's death alone, because her father's grief had taken up all the available space in that house, and about the years of teaching in small rooms with insufficient supplies, and about arriving in Sulfur Creek with 40 pounds of books and no money, and the unshakable conviction that she was in exactly the right place even though she was covered in dust and bad-tempered as anything. At 11 o'clock the door of the dusty pedal opened, and 2 men came out. Oscar saw them from the window before they separated, Prater going left and Crawford going right, and understood the geometry of what they planned, one for each access point, front and back, a simultaneous entry designed to prevent anyone inside from retreating through the other exit. They were not going to his room. They were going to Olive's house. They are at your house, he said. Olive came to the window and looked. We need to be there first, she said. No, he said. We need Hector's rifle, and we need to be visible from the front. If they go to your house and find it empty and undisturbed, they will search it and find nothing. If we appear before they are done, we interrupt their search before they can confirm whether what they want is there or not, she said. They cannot know that I moved the box. If it is not in the house, they will think it might still be there somewhere. And it resets us back to a waiting game, Oscar said, which we can survive for one more day. Then we do not go to my house, she said. No, he said. We stay here. They watched. It was a long 40 minutes. The lights in Olive's house did not go on because the men inside were too professional to light lamps, but movement was visible at one point behind the kitchen window, a shadow crossing the faint reflected light from the street. Then, nothing. Then the 2 figures separately making their way back toward the saloon and the hotel, unhurried, nothing in their hands. Oscar breathed. They found nothing, Olive said. One more day, he said. She exhaled slowly. Then she sat down on the edge of his bed because it was the only place to sit in the room that was not the chair by the window, and put her face in her hands for a moment. Not weeping, not close to it. Simply the physical expression of a tension that had been held for a very long time, briefly permitted to acknowledge itself. Oscar sat in the chair and gave her the moment. After a little while she lifted her face. I am all right, she said. I know, he said. I have been frightened for 8 months, she said. Mostly alone. I have been very careful about not thinking too much about how frightened, because it was not useful and I had work to do, and being frightened alone is its own kind of trap because there is no one to tell and it just accumulates. She stopped. I am telling you now because you are here and you are you and I am apparently making poor decisions regarding the suppression of honest feeling. These are not poor decisions, he said. These are very good decisions. She looked at him. The lamp was very low, the room was close and quiet. Come here, he said, and it was so simple and so natural that it did not seem like a decision at all. She crossed the few feet of floor and he held out his hand, and she took it and sat on the arm of the chair, and he put his arm around her carefully with the ribs in mind, and she leaned against him with a kind of careful, tentative weight that gradually became less tentative. And they sat like that in the low-lit room while the desert night moved quietly outside, and neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. He did not know when he stopped thinking of it as a tactical situation and started thinking of it as simply where he was with her in the specific gravity of the moment. He only knew that both things were true at once, that the operational reality and the personal reality had stopped being separate categories and had become the same one. This was where he was. This was who she was. These were the facts. She slept eventually lightly against his shoulder. He stayed awake at the window and watched the street and thought about 4 days becoming 3. In the morning she went back to her house and he went with her, openly, because the pretense of distance was no longer buying anything, and because after the previous night the geography of their relationship had changed and they both knew it. The house was disordered but not devastated. They had been careful, the alderman men, professional enough not to leave obvious evidence of their search, but there were small tells, a drawer not quite shut, a rug edge turned back and not fully straightened, a book shifted on its shelf. Olive walked through the rooms and set things to rights with a quiet, systematic efficiency that he found deeply admirable. She did not express distress about the violation of her space, though he suspected she felt it. She simply corrected what needed correcting. The stove genuinely does have a problem, she said from the kitchen. The flue. I can look at it, he said. You know about stoves. I know about flues, he said. When you spend years sleeping in different rooms and houses and occasionally underneath neither, you learn what makes a fire draw. She stood back and let him look at the stove. The flue damper had seized, which was simple enough, and he found a tool from her small collection and worked it free. It opened properly. Thank you, she said. You are welcome. She looked at him from across the kitchen, and the morning light came through the small window above the sink, and there was something easy and clear between them that had not been there before the previous night, a quality of comfort that did not belong to 4 days of knowing someone but that had apparently decided to arrive anyway. I would like, he said carefully, to talk to you about what happens after Fitch arrives, after all of this is resolved. He looked at her. I have been moving for 6 years. Town to town, case to case. I told myself it was the work, and to some extent that was true, but I think I also told myself that because it was easier than the alternative. Which is, she asked. Staying somewhere, he said. Being somewhere that is mine. He paused. I am not a man who says things I do not mean. I am telling you that I would like to be in a place that is mine, and that Sulfur Creek has become, very quickly and without my permission, a place where I can imagine that. Olive was still. The morning light moved slightly as a cloud passed over the sun outside. That is a large thing to say after 4 days, she said. Yes, he said. I know. I am not opposed to it, she said, slowly and carefully. I am telling you that honestly. I am also telling you that I am not someone who makes arrangements quickly and then regrets them later. I need time. I need to know a person, a pause. I need to see who you are when there is nothing frightening happening, when it is just an ordinary morning and the stove has a stuck flue and nothing is at stake. That is completely fair, he said, but I am not opposed to finding out, she said, and looked at him with the river walnut eyes and the morning light, and the something that had been building since the shirt and the needle reached a temperature that he recognized as irreversible, and that he found, to his considerable surprise, entirely welcome. The 4th day. Rowan Fitch arrived at 2 in the afternoon on the westbound stage from Albuquerque, not alone, but with two deputy marshals whose names Oscar did not know, but whose badges he recognized, with the particular feeling of a man who has been working without institutional support for long enough that the sight of official authority is a kind of relief he is not fully prepared for. Oscar met them at the stage, openly. The time for concealment was over. He shook Fitch's hand on the main street of Sulfur Creek in plain view of anyone who was watching, which included Dex Prater, who had come out of the dusty pedal and was standing very still on the saloon's small porch. Rowan Fitch was 45, compact and gray-templed, with the economy of expression of a man who has seen a great deal and has developed a system for managing it. He looked at Oscar and then at the ribs, where the wound still showed in the way Oscar moved. "You look like you lost an argument with something sharp," Fitch said. "I won," Oscar said. "The argument, the knife was less decisive." "The documents," Fitch said. "Safe," Oscar said. "I will take you to them." He took Fitch and one of the deputies to the church, where Reverend Cleary opened the sacristy with the expression of a man who had spent 4 days in communion with a profound sense of purpose and was ready to set that purpose down. The box was exactly as Olive had left it. Fitch spent 40 minutes with the documents, reading with the focused attention of an experienced legal mind cataloging evidence, and then he looked up with an expression that was the law enforcement equivalent of a very large number. 43 deeds, Fitch said, plus the documentation of method, Oscar said. Calhoun Webb's own notes on how each forgery was produced. "Webb is alive," Fitch said. This was not a question. "Apparently," Oscar said, "though I have not been able to determine where." "We will find him." Fitch looked at the stack again. "This is enough for a full reprosecution. This is enough for everyone who escaped the first one." A pause. "There is a name in here, a deputy land clerk named Grier, that is going to reach further than Sulfur Creek." "I know," Oscar said. "That is why I needed you to come rather than just a letter." Fitch nodded. He looked at Oscar with the particular kind of look that old colleagues give each other when they have done something that needed doing. "Prater," he said, "and a second man at the hotel, name of Crawford." "We will take them this afternoon," Fitch said. They did. It was not elegant and it was not complicated. 2 deputy marshals with badges, 2 men who had not expected the situation to shift so suddenly from patient surveillance to formal arrest. The geography of a small town that did not offer many alternatives. Dex Prater was taken from the saloon with his hands in front of him, and his face showing the flat resignation of a man who had known, somewhere underneath the confidence of the operation, that this was always a possible outcome. Crawford, at the hotel, was younger and less resigned, and tried briefly to argue the legal merits of his presence in Sulfur Creek, which Fitch declined to engage with. By 5 o'clock, both men were confined in the church, which was the sturdiest building in town, under the guard of the 2 deputies and the complicated pastoral disapproval of Reverend Cleary. Oscar found Olive at the school, where she had kept the children through the afternoon, because he had asked her to keep them inside, and she had understood why without being told. The children were on their 3rd reading of the same 3 pages, which they appeared to have largely memorized at this point, when Oscar knocked on the door and she looked at him and read the answer in his face. She dismissed the children gently. They left, carrying their readers, casting curious looks over their shoulders at the man in the doorway who was clearly carrying news of some kind. When they were gone, she stood in the center of the room between the rows of small desks, and he stood in the doorway, and the late afternoon light came through the 2 west-facing windows and filled the room with the warm amber of a desert sunset. "It is done," he said. She put both hands over her mouth. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Simply the physical necessity of containing something very large that was trying to come out all at once. Her eyes filled. He crossed the room and she let him take her hands from her mouth and hold them, and she looked at him with the tears still in her eyes and said, in a voice that was very steady for someone whose eyes were very full, "My father's land." "It will be restored," Oscar said. "Fitch will handle the deed correction through the land office. Once the fraudulent filing is voided with the evidence, the original deed is reinstated. Your father keeps the land. He pressed her hands lightly. He will not even need to know how close it came to going another way. She took a breath, then another. The tears did not fall. She absorbed them back by some discipline of composure that he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but was rather the management of feeling by a woman who had always had to manage her own, who had not had the luxury of collapsing into someone else's support. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke very slightly on the second word, just barely. "You did most of it," he said. "You kept the box. You moved it. You kept it safe for 8 months alone before I ever arrived." "We did it," she said, and the correction was gentle and firm, the correction of someone who is also learning, maybe, how to accept the presence of a partner in something. He held her hands and she held his, and the sunset came through the west windows of the school, and the amber light moved across the rows of small desks, and the primers stacked on the shelf, and the slate board at the front of the room where, in Olive Ford's careful block letters, the day's lesson was still written, a sentence that the children had been copying for practice. "Honesty is the foundation of all good things." He smiled when he read it. She saw him read it and smiled too, and then she laughed, a real one, full and clear, and the room opened up with it. Rowan Fitch stayed in Sulfur Creek for 3 days, completing the documentation and making arrangements for the evidence to be transported to the federal court in Santa Fe. He was, Oscar observed, a thorough and competent man who asked good questions and drew correct conclusions, and was also, apparently, entirely unable to be in the same room as Oscar Talbot and Olive Ford simultaneously, without registering something about the situation between them that made his expression do something that was almost certainly amusement, which Oscar chose not to address. On the second of Fitch's 3 days, a letter arrived from Calhoun Webb. It had been sent from El Paso, which meant he was alive and mobile and paying attention to the situation through channels that Oscar did not fully understand. The letter said that he had been watching from a safe distance and that he was relieved and that he wanted to thank Olive specifically, in terms that suggested he felt both guilty and grateful for what he had asked of her, and that he intended to cooperate fully with the new prosecution if it came to that. It would come to that. Oscar and Fitch agreed on this. "Webb is the key to the larger case," Fitch said, on the evening of his second day, sitting in the general store where Hector Dunn had produced a bottle of very good whiskey that Fitch was working through with the appreciation of a man who had earned it. Oscar had water, as always. "Without his testimony, we have the documents, but we need his voice to explain the forgery method in a way that will hold up to the defense arguments." "He will come," Oscar said. "He is trying to make right what he was part of." "He always was. That is why he testified in '79. And the question of his fake death," Fitch said. "I expect he had his reasons," Oscar said. "When the time comes, I expect he will explain them." Fitch looked at him with the slight sideways quality of a man whose attention has moved from the professional topic to the personal one. "Are you planning to stay in Sulfur Creek?" he asked. "For a while," Oscar said. Said Fitch, and poured himself another measure and said nothing further, which was, Oscar reflected, one of the things he had always respected about Rowan Fitch. After Fitch left on the 3rd morning, with the documents and the 2 arrested men and the 2 deputies, Oscar felt the peculiar stillness that follows the end of something large. The crisis had a shape when it was happening. It gave the day's structure and urgency and direction. And now it was resolved, and the structure had dissolved into the ordinary mornings of Sulfur Creek, the ordinary dust and heat, and the sound of children going to school, and the bell of Reverend Cleary's church marking the hours. He went to the school at the end of the afternoon. He had gone to the school at the end of the afternoon every day since the crisis ended, and Olive had been waiting each time at the bench outside with the stack of books and the slate under her arm, and the expression of someone who has been looking forward to the end of the afternoon, and is not embarrassed about it. She was there. He sat beside her on the bench. "What is the lesson tomorrow?" he asked. "Geography," she said. "The territories. I have a map, but it is 3 years old and has errors, and there is apparently no money in the school board's current fund to replace it." "I could draw a map," he said. She looked at him. "You could. I have been through most of the territories. I have a reasonably accurate mental image of the geography." He paused. "My drawing is workable, not artistic but workable." "I think that is the best offer I have had all month," she said. He looked at her. The late sun was on her face, and she was looking at the road ahead of her with that particular expression that he had learned contained more than it showed. "I would like to stay," he said, "in Sulfur Creek. I told you I was thinking about it. I want you to know that the thinking has resolved itself into a decision." She was quiet for a moment. "What would you do here?" she said. Not resistant, not discouraging, practically curious. "I have been speaking to the county sheriff," he said. "Briggs, who you spoke to about the documents, who was not as useful as he might have been. He is not a bad man. He is simply understaffed and overwhelmed. He has been looking for a deputy for 8 months. I told him I was available if the appointment could be processed through Santa Fe, which Fitch has agreed to facilitate." Olive turned to look at him fully. "You are going to be the deputy sheriff of Sulfur Creek?" "Possibly," he said, "if you have no objection to having a lawman in close proximity to your school." "I have no objection," she said, and there was the full open smile again, and something else in it that was not the smile but was behind it, a warmth and a certainty that she let him see all at once, straightforwardly, without the careful guardedness that had been in everything at the beginning. "I have no objection at all." He held out his hand. She took it. They sat on the bench outside the school in the late afternoon of a desert September, holding hands on the edge of the main road in Sulfur Creek, New Mexico territory, with the mountains turning red and gold in the west, and the smell of someone cooking somewhere down the road, and the day settled around them with the particular quality of an ordinary thing that is also, if you are paying attention, extraordinary. He stayed. The appointment came through in October of that year, 1882, and Oscar Talbot became the deputy sheriff of Sulfur Creek, with an office in the back of Hector Dunn's store that Hector generously partitioned off and called official space, which it was not officially but which served the purpose. He had a desk, a chair, a set of territorial law books that Rowan Fitch sent down from Albuquerque as a housewarming of sorts, and a badge that he wore without ambivalence for the first time in years, because the jurisdiction was small enough that he could hold it honestly. He was good at the work. He had always been good at the work, but the scale was different now, domestic in the best sense of the word, the management of small disputes, the careful navigation of the town's social tensions, the patient building of a relationship with the community that was not about prosecution but about presence. He began to know the people of Sulfur Creek, the families on the ranches outside town, the Mexican families in the south end of the main road, whose relationship to the law had historically been shaped by injustice, and who approached Oscar with understandable caution that he tried to deserve his way through. The Reverend Cleary, who had never asked a question about the box, and who Oscar eventually thanked directly, to which Cleary said with serene brevity that what was right was usually obvious, and the only difficulty was doing it. He knew the children, because the children came through his days in the ordinary way they come through any small town's days, crossing in front of him on the road, asking questions that ranged from sensible to entirely unexpected, carrying messages from parents, making up their own versions of events. He knew them partly because they were Olive's students, and she talked about them in the evenings with the specific fond attention of someone for whom each child is individually present and not simply a group. The evenings. They had dinner together most evenings. Sometimes at the Mexican restaurant, sometimes at her house where she cooked with the satisfied precision of someone who has always found it meaningful, sometimes at the makeshift office where he had acquired a small stove, and she would bring food, and they would eat at his desk with law books pushed to the sides. These were the ordinary evenings of two people building an ordinary life alongside each other, which is the most extraordinary thing in the world when you are paying attention. He drew the map for the geography lesson in November, sitting at her kitchen table with a blank piece of butcher paper and an ink pen, and she leaned over his shoulder and pointed out an error in the placement of the Rio Grande near the Texas border. "I have been to the Rio Grande near the Texas border," he said, "and I have read 2 different surveys of it," she said. He corrected the placement. The map went up on the wall of the school the next morning. He walked by in the afternoon and looked through the window and saw it there, his workable if not artistic rendering of the territories hanging next to Olive's slate board, and felt something that was complicated and entirely good. He proposed to her in December, on a cold night when the desert had gone silver with frost and the stars were so bright they seemed to be making noise. They were walking back from the church, where Reverend Cleary had hosted a small community gathering of the kind the town did in winter when the collective need for warmth, literal and otherwise, brought people together. It had been a good evening. There had been singing, which Oscar did not participate in because his singing voice was an offense to the ear, and there had been Hector Dunn's excellent coffee and one of the ranching wives' extraordinary pie, and there had been 40 people in a small building sharing the fact of each other's existence, which was, Oscar had come to understand, what civilization actually was. They were walking back on the frost-white road and he stopped and she stopped beside him and the stars were extraordinary above the desert mountains and he said, simply, "Olive." She looked at him. "I want you to marry me," he said. "I want to be here in Sulfur Creek with you for the rest of what comes. I want to wake up in the morning in a place that is mine and ours. I want to sit at your kitchen table and drink coffee and hear about the children and tell you about the day and fall asleep in the same house. I want the ordinary things that I spent 6 years moving away from because I did not understand they were what I was looking for." She stood in the frost-white road and the stars blazed above her, and she looked at him with the river walnut eyes and the full open expression that she no longer guarded, that she had stopped guarding the evening in October when he had come back from a hard day of work and sat down at her kitchen table without being invited, and she had set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, and they had both registered that something had settled permanently into place. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Obviously, yes." He kissed her there on the frost-white road, which was the first time he had kissed her, and she kissed him back with both hands on his face, and the cold air was around them, and the stars were blazing, and it was December in New Mexico territory, and he had never been so certain of anything in his adult life. They were married in the spring of 1883 in Reverend Cleary's church, which was full beyond its capacity with the people of Sulfur Creek and several who rode in from the surrounding ranches and one Rowan Fitch who came down from Albuquerque and sat in the front row and wept with a composure that fooled no one. Elijah Ford came from Fisher County, Texas, for the wedding, a tall man in his 60s with Olive's eyes and the deeply weathered look of a man who has spent 4 decades working land in a relentless climate. He shook Oscar's hand with both of his and looked at him with the particular assessment of a father who is checking the man standing across from his daughter and then, apparently satisfied, said, "She told me you fixed the flue." "The damper was seized," Oscar said. "That stove has always been contrary," Elijah said. "Welcome to the family." They wrote to Calhoun Webb with the news and received a letter back from El Paso, several pages long, full of genuine happiness, and only slightly undermined by the fact that Calhoun wrote at the bottom, in a postscript, that he had decided to testify in the new prosecution after all, and that he was looking forward to getting it over with, and that he hoped Oscar could guarantee safe passage, which Oscar, with Fitch's cooperation, was able to do. The prosecution of the Alderman Syndicate's second tier, using Calhoun's testimony and the evidence from the box in the sacristy of Reverend Cleary's church, concluded in the federal court in Santa Fe in November of 1883, with 6 convictions including the deputy land clerk Grier. The fraudulent deeds were voided. 43 families had their land confirmed. The Ford River Ranch in Fisher County, Texas, remained Elijah Ford's as it had always been, as it deserved to be, as it would be going forward. Oscar Talbot remained the deputy sheriff of Sulfur Creek for 4 years, until the county offered him the position of sheriff, which he accepted in 1886 and held with the same honest, patient, daily commitment he had brought to the deputy position, with the additional responsibility and the additional complexity and the knowledge, by then well established and comfortable, that he had somewhere to come home to. He and Olive had a son in the summer of 1884, whom they named Elijah James Talbot, Elijah for her father and James for Oscar's, a name Oscar had not used in 6 years, and that he reclaimed with the particular quiet reclamation of a man who is putting himself back together from the outside in. The boy arrived healthy and furious, and grew up in Sulfur Creek with the particular unself-conscious confidence of a child who has been genuinely loved in a stable place, who runs to his mother's school in the afternoon and sits on the deputy's desk in the office and knows every person in town by name by the age of 4. A daughter arrived 3 years later in 1887, named Clara, who had Oscar's tendency toward silence and Olive's directness, and who arrived in the world with a look on her face that suggested she found the arrangement acceptable but reserved the right to further evaluation. Olive kept the school. She expanded it in 1885, with funds from the school board and a considerable private donation from a ranching family whose children she had taught for 3 years, and the roof she built herself did not have a single problem with the flue, which Oscar checked personally. She taught in Sulfur Creek for 20 years in all. Children who went through her school grew up and had children of their own and sent those children to the school, and the primers multiplied, and the map on the wall was updated twice, and the slate board was replaced with a proper blackboard in 1890, and the caneback chair that she had carried across the road to a rented room above a general store in August of 1882 sat in the corner of the school for decades, used by whoever needed to sit down, carrying no particular significance to anyone who did not know its history. Oscar knew its history. Some mornings, walking past the school on his way to the office, he would see the chair through the window and think about a needle and a torn shirt, and a silence that had contained more truth than most conversations. He thought about it the way you think about the hinge points of your life, the small, ordinary moments that turned out to be the large and permanent ones. He thought about it with gratitude. In 1888, Calhoun Webb passed away in El Paso, having completed his testimony, having cooperated fully with the prosecution, having apparently spent his last years with some measure of peace. He left a note for Olive, sent through a lawyer, that said simply, "The box did what I hoped. Thank you for keeping it safe. I am glad you found someone worth trusting it to." Olive read the note at the kitchen table on an ordinary evening in October, with Oscar across from her and Elijah doing his reading in the next room and Clara asleep upstairs, and she folded the note and sat with it for a moment and then looked at Oscar and said, "He was a complicated man." "He was," Oscar said. "He did a great deal of harm," she said, "and then he spent a long time trying to correct it." "Yes," Oscar said. "I think that is the most any of us can do," she said. "When we have been wrong, try to correct it and not stop trying." He looked at her across the kitchen table on an ordinary October evening in Sulfur Creek, New Mexico Territory, 1888, with the children in the next rooms and the stove drawing perfectly, and the caneback chair visible through the doorway against the kitchen wall. He looked at her with the full, honest attention of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it clearly. "I think that is exactly right," he said. She smiled. The river walnut eyes, the full, open warmth of a woman who has built something real and knows it, who has chosen and been chosen and trusts the choosing completely. He reached across the table and she took his hand and they sat in the kitchen in the ordinary, remarkable evening of their lives, and the desert night moved quietly outside, and the stars came up enormous over the mountains, and Sulfur Creek settled into its familiar dark and peace. And everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be said had been said. And what remained was the long good time of the ordinary life they had made together, morning after morning, evening after evening, in the place that was theirs.